The Mercedes slammed into the guardrail at 90 miles per hour. Metal screamed against concrete. Glass exploded into 1,000 glittering fragments, and the world spun in violent circles before everything went dark. When the paramedics pulled Lee Hyun-kong from the wreckage, his pulse was barely there, a whisper against their fingertips. At St. Catherine's Hospital, the physician gave a grim assessment: severe head trauma, broken ribs, and a punctured lung. He was stable, barely, but the next 72 hours would determine everything. As Hyun-kong drifted in the gray void of his mind, the fog suddenly lifted, but his body remained an iron cage. He was awake, trapped in his own flesh, unable to twitch a finger or flutter an eyelid. He expected to feel the warm, frantic hands of his family. Instead, he felt only the chill of the ICU air and the sharp sting of their words. The Hyun-kong family gathered like ravens on a wire. His wife, Madison Flair, sat rigid, her eyes glued to her phone rather than his battered face. His son, Ji-ho, paced the small room, already on his third call with the board of directors. "The optics of this are terrible," Ji-ho muttered into his phone, his voice devoid of tremor. "I know he's my father, but we have shareholders to consider." Hyun-kong's heart, though weak, hammered against his ribs in silent fury. He had built an empire to shield them, and yet, here they were, measuring his casket before he was even cold. Then came the sharpest betrayal. Madison's lawyer arrived within the hour, his footsteps clicking rhythmically on the linoleum. "We should discuss the living will," the lawyer whispered, pulling Madison aside. Hyun-kong heard it all: the calculated debate over when to pull the plug, the concern for stock prices, and the blatant relief in their voices when they decided to hire a stranger to handle the depressing reality of his dying. The rage burned through him like acid. 30 years of marriage and 2 children he'd given the world to, and he was being treated like a chore to be outsourced. He lay there, a silent witness to his own erasure, waiting for a single spark of genuine grief that never came. Before we continue with the rest of the story, remember to hit that like button, comment where you are watching from, and subscribe for more beautiful stories. Also drop your thoughts. If you were in Hyun-kong's shoes, what would you do to your family as soon as you regain your health back? The physician's voice was clinical, a sharp contrast to the chaotic violence of the crash that had brought Lee Hyun-kong to St. Catherine's Hospital. He spoke of severe head trauma, shattered ribs, and a punctured lung. His assessment as grim as the gray morning light filtering through the ICU windows. To the medical staff, Hyun-kong was a body to be stabilized. To the family gathered around him, he was an asset to be liquidated. Madison Flair stood at the foot of the bed, her expression a mask of practiced concern that didn't quite reach her eyes. She smoothed the fabric of her expensive coat, her mind clearly elsewhere as she checked her phone every few seconds. Beside her, Ji-ho continued his relentless pacing, the soles of his shoes squeaking against the sterile tile. He wasn't looking at his father's bruised face or the machines breathing for him. He was looking at a digital stock ticker. "The board is already whispering about a leadership vacuum," Ji-ho muttered, his voice cold and efficient. "If he doesn't wake up in 48 hours, we need to move on the succession plan." Jimin, the youngest, leaned against the wall, scrolling through her social media feed with a look of profound boredom. She glanced up only once, not to offer a prayer or a touch, but to complain about the disruption to her schedule. "I'm supposed to be in Paris next week," she sighed, her voice laced with irritation. "How long are we expected to just sit here and watch these monitors?" Hyun-kong heard it all. Each word was a fresh wound, deeper than any injury sustained in the Mercedes. He wanted to roar, to demand why the family he had protected with his own blood now viewed his survival as an inconvenience. He felt the weight of their indifference like a heavy shroud. They spoke of him as if he were already a ghost, a name on a legal document rather than a man who had loved them. In that silent, sterile room, the dragon of the underworld realized that his greatest enemies weren't the rivals who had run him off the road, but the heirs who couldn't wait for him to stop breathing. By the third day, the novelty of tragedy had worn thin for the Hyun-kong family. The rhythmic hiss of the ventilator and the sterile rhythmic beeping of the monitors had become an unbearable soundtrack to their impatience. Madison Flair stood by the window, her silhouette sharp against the morning sun. Her fingers drumming a restless pattern on her designer handbag. "We need someone here," she announced, her voice echoing with a cold finality. "Around the clock. I simply cannot do this. It's far too depressing." Ji-ho nodded in immediate agreement, not looking up from his tablet as he reviewed the latest market fluctuations. "The press is starting to circle," he added, his tone clinical. "We need to show the public that we care, but we have a company to run. We can't have the board seeing us idling in a hospital room." For them, the ICU was not a place of healing or vigil. It was a cage that restricted their movements and stifled their luxury. They needed a buffer, a living proxy to shoulder the burden of a dying man's presence, so they could return to the high-stakes world he had built for them. That was when they hired Monique Harris. She was a woman who had been in the city for exactly 4 months, living in a cramped studio while sending every possible cent back home to Alabama, where her own mother was locked in a desperate battle with breast cancer. To the nursing agency, Monique was a private care specialist. To the Hyun Kong family, she was a professional witness to a life they were ready to leave behind. The pay offered was extraordinary, enough to cover Monique's mother's treatments for half a year, but she had no idea the patient was the infamous Lee Hyun Kong. She only knew that a man was lying alone in the dark. Monique arrived at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday, carrying a worn Bible and a photo of her mother. The briefing from the staff was efficient and detached. The patient was unresponsive, brain activity was minimal, and the family would visit only occasionally. Her job was simple: monitor his vitals, keep him clean, and talk to him on the off chance he could still hear. As the door clicked shut behind the family's departure, Monique stepped toward the bed. Hyun Kong, trapped in his silent tower, heard the soft, steady rhythm of her footsteps. For the first time since the crash, the air in the room didn't feel like ice. It felt like a beginning. The door clicked shut with a clinical finality, leaving Lee Hyun Kong in a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. For days, the only sounds had been the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator and the cold, transactional whispers of his family. But then a new sound entered the room, the soft, steady rhythm of footsteps that didn't hurry and didn't hesitate. Monique Harris stepped into the light of the ICU, carrying a small bag that held her entire world, a worn Bible with frayed edges and a framed photo of her mother. She didn't look at the monitors first, nor did she check the chart with the detached efficiency of the nurses. Instead, she walked straight to the side of the bed and looked at the man lying there. For the first time since the Mercedes had spun into oblivion, someone looked at Hyun Kong not as a leadership vacuum or a legal obstacle, but as a human being in need of care. "Hello, Mr. Lee," she said, her voice a gentle, melodic contrast to the sterile environment. "My name is Monique. I'm going to be looking after you." She reached out, her hand resting lightly and respectfully on his arm. To Hyun Kong, the touch was electric. It was the first time in years he had felt a hand that didn't want something from him. "I know they say you probably can't hear me," she continued softly, "but I'm going to talk to you anyway. My daddy always said a person's spirit stays awake even when their body is resting." As she began to pull a chair close to his bed, she set the photo of her mother on the bedside table, turning it so it faced them both. "I'm a long way from home, Mr. Lee," she confessed, her voice carrying a hint of a southern lilt. "I come from a place in Alabama where the magnolias bloom so thick you can smell them from 3 blocks away." She told him about the Sunday dinners that were sacred and the struggle that had brought her to this cold city, to save her mother's life by tending to his. Hyun Kong lay in his frozen tower, listening to the warmth of her words. He had spent his life amassing power through fear and silent commands, yet here was a woman who possessed a different kind of power, the power of simple, unwavering kindness. As Monique began to read a psalm in a low, steady hum, the dragon of the underworld felt something he hadn't felt in decades. He felt seen. The days in the ICU blurred into a singular rhythmic hum, marked only by the shifting light against the sterile walls and the steady, comforting presence of Monique Harris. While the world outside continued to move at the frantic pace of the Hyun Kong Empire, Inside the room, time seemed to slow down. Monique settled into the chair beside his bed. Her voice a warm anchor in the silent void where Lee Hyun-kong remained trapped. "My daddy used to say that we're all just walking each other home," Monique began one afternoon, her fingers deftly adjusting the pillows beneath his head. She spoke of the magnolia tree in their yard in Alabama, its blossoms heavy and fragrant in the spring heat, and how her father would sit beneath its shade after a long day of work. He wasn't a man of great wealth or titles, she explained, but he was a man of immense presence. She described the way he would sing hymns while fixing breakfast. His voice rough but filled with a peace that made the small house feel like a palace. "He didn't have much to leave behind in a will," she said softly, a sad but beautiful smile touching her lips, "but he left me with a feeling of being cherished. He taught me that the greatest gift you can give someone is simply letting them know they don't have to make the journey alone." Hyun-kong felt something crack deep within his chest as he listened. The stories of this simple man from Alabama acted as a mirror, reflecting a life Hyun-kong had never known. He had spent 30 years building skyscrapers and crushing rivals to provide his children with luxury, yet he realized now that he had given Ji-ho and Ji-min everything except what Monique's father had given her: his time and his heart. He thought of his son's cold calculations and his daughter's bored indifference during their brief, clinical visits. He had raised them to be successful, but he had failed to raise them to be kind. As Monique continued to speak of a father who was just a man who made sure the people he loved knew they were loved, the dragon of the underworld felt a profound, aching regret. He had built a fortress of gold, only to discover he was the only one living inside it. The sterile silence of the ICU was punctured by the sharp, impatient click of heels against the tile. Ji-min swept into the room, her presence a whirlwind of shallow irritation that seemed to suck the warmth from the air Monique had carefully cultivated. Without a glance at the pale, tattooed man fighting for his life in the bed, she dropped into the chair Monique had just vacated, her eyes fixed solely on the glowing screen of her phone. "I honestly can't believe this," Ji-min sighed, her voice a jagged edge of entitlement. "Do you have any idea how much the deposit was for that villa in Monaco? And now I have to stay here in this depressing hospital because the lawyers say it looks better for the probate proceedings." She groaned, scrolling through photos of friends already on the Mediterranean. "It's so unfair. He's just lying there anyway. It's not like he knows if I'm here or at the beach." Hyun-kong, trapped behind the mask of his closed eyelids, felt a coldness settle in his marrow that had nothing to do with the four fluids. Each word from his daughter was a betrayal more agonizing than the crash itself. He had spent decades ensuring she never knew the meaning of the word no, only to realize he had raised a stranger who viewed his potential death as a scheduling conflict. In stark contrast, Monique moved around the bed with a quiet, reverent grace. She didn't interrupt Ji-min's tirade. Instead, she focused on the man who was being treated like a ghost in his own room. With a basin of warm water and a soft cloth, she began to gently clean the abrasions on Hyun-kong's forearm, her touch light and respectful as she moved around the intricate ink of the tiger tattoo on his hand. "There we go, Mr. Lee," Monique whispered, her voice a low hum that acted as a shield against Ji-min's venom. "Almost done. You're doing so well today." Ji-min didn't even look up as Monique worked. She was too busy typing a scathing message to her travel agent. To Ji-min, her father was a bank account that had temporarily frozen. To Monique, he was a soul worth the effort of a gentle touch. As the cool water touched his skin, Hyun-kong realized the crushing truth. The woman paid to be there was the only one who truly saw him, while the daughter he had given the world to was already looking past him toward the inheritance. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip, casting long amber shadows across the sterile hospital floor, when Monique's phone vibrated on the bedside table. She had been humming a low, soulful tune while adjusting Hyun-kong's 4 lines, but the hum died instantly as she pressed the phone to her ear. Hyun-kong, trapped in his silent vigil, heard the sharp intake of her breath, a sound so fragile it seemed to fracture the very air in the room. "I see," Monique whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf in a storm. "And the doctors?" "They're sure. Stage 4. A heavy, suffocating silence followed. The voice on the other end was a faint, tinny murmur, but the devastation it carried was absolute. Monique didn't scream, she didn't collapse. She simply stood there, the phone slipping from her hand onto the padded chair. The news that her mother's cancer had spread, that the battle she had moved across the country to fund was being lost, hit her with a force that transcended physical pain. Hyun Kong felt the shift in the room immediately. The warmth that usually radiated from Monique was replaced by a cold, hollow loneliness that seemed to seep into his own bones. It was a grief so profound it felt like a physical presence, a thick fog that dampened the sound of the heart monitor. For months, he had been the one dying, but in this moment, he felt the weight of a different kind of death, the death of hope. Monique walked to the window, her back to him, her shoulders shaking with silent, rhythmic sobs. "I promised her, Mr. Lee," she choked out, her voice barely audible over the hiss of his ventilator. "I promised I'd bring her the best medicine money could buy. I promised she wouldn't have to go like my daddy did, hurting and afraid." She turned back toward him, her face wet with tears, but her eyes weren't on the monitors or the machines. She looked at him with a raw, bleeding honesty that no one in his life had ever shown him. "I'm so scared," she whispered, reaching out to touch the tiger tattoo on his hand. "I'm all she has left, and I'm stuck here miles away, working for people who don't even care if you breathe, just so I can pay for a miracle that isn't coming." The pain in her voice was a serrated blade. Hyun Kong's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. He wanted to reach out, to catch her tears, to tell her that her sacrifice was the most beautiful thing he had ever witnessed. For the first time, his desire to wake up wasn't fueled by a need for revenge against his family. It was fueled by a desperate, soul-deep need to comfort the stranger who had become his only friend. The room was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the heavy, invisible weight of Monique's heartbreak. She sat back down in the worn vinyl chair, her eyes red-rimmed and her spirit visibly fractured. For the first time, she didn't read from her Bible or tell a cheerful story of the South. She simply stared at the monitor, watching the jagged green line of Hyun Kong's heart rate, her hand trembling as it hovered near his. "I wonder, Mr. Lee," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry parchment. "Did they ever say it? Your children? Did they ever just sit here, look you in the eyes when you were well and say, thank you?" She wiped a stray tear with the back of her hand, a hollow laugh escaping her lips. "I've been here 2 weeks, and I've heard them talk about your money, your cars, and your legacy. But I haven't heard a single thank you for the life you gave them. My mama. She has nothing, but every time I send a few dollars, she cries and tells me I'm her greatest blessing. And here I am, losing the one person who truly loves me, while you're surrounded by people who are just waiting for the light to go out." The raw injustice of her words acted like a lightning strike to Hyun Kong's paralyzed nervous system. Deep within the iron cage of his body, the dragon roared. The fury he had felt for his family and the profound empathy he felt for this girl fused into a singular, explosive force of will. He focused every ounce of his consciousness, every scrap of his remaining strength, into the fingertips of his right hand, the one marked with the tiger that Monique had cleaned so gently. The effort was agonizing, a mental straining against 1,000 pounds of lead. Then it happened. A minute jerky movement of his index finger. Monique froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Mr. Lee," she breathed, leaning forward. With a final, desperate surge of power, Hyun Kong's hand closed. It wasn't a reflex. It was a firm, intentional squeeze. His fingers locking around Monique's hand with a strength that defied his medical chart. At the same time, a hot, salt-heavy tear escaped the corner of his closed eye, tracing a slow path through the bruising on his cheek. Monique let out a sob that was half gasp, half scream. "You're there," she choked out, falling to her knees beside the bed, her forehead resting against his tattooed knuckles. "You're in there. You heard me." In that moment the bridge was built. The Mafia boss and the maid were no longer strangers. They were two souls clinging to each other in a storm of betrayal and grief. Hyun Kong couldn't speak yet, but his silent tears and the pressure of his grip said everything. I am here, and you are not alone. The following morning, the atmosphere in the ICU changed. It was no longer a room of quiet vigil, but a stage for a final, cold performance. Madison Flair and her 2 children entered, the air of the room instantly turning brittle under the weight of their resentment. They stood at the foot of the bed, a distance they rarely crossed, while Monique stood by the window, her eyes swollen but her spirit emboldened by the secret she now shared with the man in the bed. The lawyers are finalizing the petition for temporary guardianship, Madison said, her voice sharp and clinical as she smoothed her skirt. It's better this way, Ji-ho. We can't have the estate in limbo indefinitely while he just sits here. Ji-ho nodded, checking his watch. The board is meeting at noon. Once the paperwork is signed, we can move forward with the divestment. Jimin let out a long, dramatic sigh. Can we just hurry this up? The smell of bleach in here is giving me a migraine. Monique stepped forward, her hand instinctively reaching for the Bible on the nightstand, but before she could speak, a sound tore through the room that froze the blood in their veins. It was a low, rasping growl, a sound of grinding stone and rusted iron. Get out! The family recoiled as if they had been struck. Madison's phone slipped from her hand, clattering onto the floor. Slowly, with an agonizing deliberation that commanded the room, Lee Hyun-kong opened his eyes. They weren't the clouded eyes of a dying man. They were the piercing, lethal eyes of the dragon. He turned his head, his gaze locking onto Madison with a ferocity that made her stagger back. I said, get out, he repeated, his voice gaining strength, each word a hammer blow of authority. Hyun-kong, Madison gasped, her face draining of color until it matched the hospital sheets. You're awake. We thought, the doctors said. You thought I was a corpse to be picked clean, Hyun-kong spat, the effort of speaking forcing a bead of sweat down his temple. He looked at Ji-ho and Jimin, his children, who stood paralyzed with an indignant and confused expression, their greed suddenly exposed to the light. I heard every word, every calculation, every sigh of boredom. Father, we were just trying to protect the legacy. Ji-ho began, his voice cracking. You are no longer part of my legacy, Hyun-kong interrupted, his hand, the one that had squeezed Monique's the night before, gesturing toward the door with shaking but unmistakable intent. Madison, take your lawyers and your optics and leave. Ji-ho, Jimin. You wanted to be rid of the chore of my life. You have your wish. You are dead to me. The room remained in a stunned, suffocating silence until Hyun-kong's gaze softened as it landed on Monique. He looked back at his family, his lip curling in disgust. Leave us. Now. Defeated and exposed, the 3 of them retreated, their footsteps echoing with a hollow, frantic rhythm as they fled the room they had expected to be a tomb. As the door swung shut, the room returned to a profound, peaceful silence. Hyun-kong let out a long, ragged breath and looked at Monique, his eyes shimmering with a mix of exhaustion and newfound clarity. The dragon had awakened, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking for redemption. The silence that followed the family's departure was not empty. It was filled with the weight of things finally understood. Lee Hyun-kong lay back against his pillows, the fire of his anger cooling into a steady, glowing resolve. He turned his head toward Monique, who remained by the bedside, her hand still trembling as she wiped the remnants of shock and grief from her face. Monique, he rasped, his voice stronger now, though still bearing the scars of the ventilator. The phone. Bring it to me. With shaking hands, she retrieved his personal cell phone from the drawer where the nurses had stowed it. Hyun-kong didn't call his lawyers or his lieutenants. He dialed a private number. His personal physician and the head of his charitable foundation. The conversation was brief and punctuated by the sharp, undeniable commands of a man who had reclaimed his throne. When he ended the call, he looked at Monique, his eyes shimmering with a profound paternal warmth. It is done, he said softly. I have arranged a medical transport. It leaves in 2 hours. You are going home, Monique. Monique blinked, her breath hitching. Mr. Lee, I can't. The contract, the pay. The pay is settled, he interrupted, a faint smile touching his lips. I have transferred enough to cover your mother's treatments, the experimental therapies, the best surgeons in the country, everything. And I am adding a trust for your family's future. You saved my life, Monique. Not with medicine, but by reminding me that I had one. He reached out, taking her hand, the hand of the stranger who had prayed for him when his own blood was counting his money. For 2 weeks, you were the daughter I wish I'd raised, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. My children saw a bank account, but you saw a man. You honored your father by becoming exactly who he hoped you'd be. Now go. Do for your mother what my children couldn't do for me. Hold her hand. Don't waste a single second. Monique fell to her knees, weeping openly as she pressed her forehead against his tattooed hand. Thank you, she sobbed. Thank you for seeing me. No, Hyun Kong replied, a tear of his own finally falling. Thank you for showing me what I lost by never being present, and what I can still become if I try. You told me your father said we are all just walking each other home. It's time for you to walk her home, Monique. As she gathered her Bible and the photo of her mother, she kissed his forehead one last time. When the door finally closed behind her, Hyun Kong didn't feel alone. He looked at the empty room, ready to face the long road of recovery and the man he was determined to become. 6 months after the crash, Lee Hyun Kong stood on the balcony of his private estate, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The cane he leaned on was a reminder of the physical cost of his accident, but the clarity in his eyes was something he hadn't possessed in decades. He breathed in the scent of salt air and pine, no longer the sterile, suffocating smell of the ICU. His empire still stood, divested, streamlined, and purged of those who viewed loyalty as a line item, but for the first time it was no longer his entire identity. On the table beside him sat a handwritten letter from Alabama. It spoke of a successful surgery, a mother's laughter, and a garden full of magnolias in bloom. Monique had sent a photo of herself and her mother, both beaming with a radiance that no amount of Lee's money could have bought, only protected. He touched the edge of the paper with the same hand that bore the tiger tattoo, realizing that this small, folded piece of stationery was more valuable to him than any stock certificate he had ever signed. He looked at his reflection in the glass door. For 30 years, he had been a provider, a name on skyscrapers, a shadow in the underworld, a man who gave his family everything they could ever want while giving them nothing of who he actually was. He had mistaken survival for living and wealth for worth. He had raised Ji-ho and Ji-min to be predators because he had been the apex of that world, never realizing that by shielding them from struggle, he had shielded them from the very empathy that made a person whole. His phone buzzed with a message from his new personal assistant, but he ignored it. He was no longer a slave to the optics or the leadership vacuum. He thought of Monique's father, a man who had left behind nothing but the feeling of being cherished, and he finally understood his new mission. He wasn't just a survivor of a 90 miles per hour crash. He was a survivor of a wasted life. Hyun Kong turned away from the sprawling city lights and walked back inside his home, which no longer felt like a fortress of gold. He had spent a lifetime building a name, but he would spend the rest of it becoming a father. He had learned that love wasn't a transaction or an inheritance. It was the quiet, steady choice to be present. As he sat down to write a response to Monique, the dragon of the underworld was gone. In his place was simply a man, finally home, making sure that for the first time in his life, the people he cared for knew they were truly loved.